On a bone-chilling December evening in downtown Chicago, when most people were rushing home to their warm beds, 68-year-old Thomas sat on his usual street corner, carefully unwrapping his only meal of the day, a sandwich from the local shelter. The steam from his breath created small clouds in the frigid air as his weathered hands trembled, partly from the cold and partly from hunger. He hadn't eaten in almost 24 hours. That's when he noticed the man in the expensive suit, standing alone under a broken streetlight. Despite his fine clothing, the stranger was shivering violently, his face pale and distant. Something about the man's empty stare reminded Thomas of the same hopelessness he'd seen in his own reflection countless times. Without hesitation, Thomas stood up, his joints creaking in protest. Clutching his precious sandwich, he shuffled through the snow toward the stranger. "Here," he said, tearing the sandwich in half, "you look like you need this more than I do." The businessman turned, revealing tears frozen on his cheeks. As they shared the simple meal under the flickering streetlight, neither man could have predicted how this single act of kindness would unravel a decades-old mystery and change both their lives forever. The businessman reached into his pocket, pulling out an old, worn photograph that would soon reveal an extraordinary connection between these two seemingly different souls. With trembling hands, the stranger held up the photograph, and in that moment, Thomas's world stopped. The image he saw would not only bridge their past lives but would also rewrite their futures in ways neither could have imagined. This chance encounter, born from a simple shared sandwich, was about to expose a truth that had remained buried for 30 years. This concise hook sets up the intrigue and emotional stakes while leaving readers wanting to know more about the photograph, the connection between these men, and how their lives will change. It introduces the key elements without revealing too much, drawing viewers in for the full story. Let me know when you'd like me to continue with part 2 by giving the continue command. Life hadn't always been this harsh for Thomas. 30 years ago, he proudly served as a combat medic in the military, saving countless lives during his tours of duty. His steady hands and quick thinking had earned him several commendations, and his fellow soldiers often said they felt safer just knowing he was around. After his service, he'd built a comfortable life working as an emergency room nurse in Chicago's busiest hospital. The old-timers at the shelter would never guess that the quiet man who now slept on their cots once owned a beautiful 2-story house in the suburbs, complete with a white picket fence and a garden his wife Linda had lovingly tended. Their life together wasn't extravagant, but it was rich with love and purpose. They'd never had children of their own, but Linda had a special way with kids, volunteering at the children's ward where Thomas worked. Everything changed one rainy October evening in 1993. Linda had stayed late at the hospital, reading to a young patient who was afraid of an upcoming surgery. On her drive home, a drunk driver ran a red light. Thomas was working the ER shift when they brought her in, but despite his years of experience saving others, he couldn't save the person who mattered most. The grief sent Thomas into a spiral. He started making mistakes at work, small ones at first, until a major error nearly cost a patient's life. Though the patient survived, Thomas couldn't forgive himself. He resigned before they could fire him, his confidence shattered. Without Linda's steady presence, he struggled to maintain their home, eventually missing mortgage payments. The house went first, then their savings. Thomas tried various jobs, but the weight of his past mistakes and loss haunted him. His sister offered him a room in Minnesota, but he couldn't bear to leave Chicago, the city where Linda's memory lived in every corner. Pride kept him from accepting help, and gradually, his world shrank to what he could carry in a weathered backpack. Yet even as he navigated life on the streets, Thomas never lost his instinct to help others. He became known among the homeless community as Doc, the guy who could dress a wound or know when someone needed real medical attention. He'd walk sick homeless veterans to the VA hospital, ensuring they got care. The local shelter staff noticed how he would give up his blanket on cold nights to newcomers, especially the elderly or disabled. Time had weathered his appearance, turning his hair snow-white and deepening the lines around his eyes, but it hadn't dampened his spirit of service. The same hands that once performed life-saving procedures in combat now helped fellow homeless people bandage their wounds with whatever supplies he could gather. He kept his medical knowledge sharp by reading discarded medical journals he found at the library, where he spent most days staying warm and updating himself on modern medical practices. Every year on Linda's birthday, he would sit in the hospital garden where they used to have lunch together. The nurses who knew his story would bring him coffee, but few remained who remembered the skilled nurse he once was. Life had taught Thomas that everything could change in an instant, but he never imagined that sharing half a sandwich would lead to another such moment, one that would unearth a connection so profound it would shake the foundations of his solitary existence. Let me know when you'd like me to continue with part 3 by giving the continue command. The evening of their encounter had started like any other for Thomas. He'd spent the afternoon at his usual spot in the public library, poring over medical journals until closing time forced him back into the bitter cold. The shelter was already full when he arrived, but the kind-hearted volunteer, Mrs. Chen, had managed to save him his usual sandwich, turkey and cheese that day. The temperature had plunged below freezing, and the wind whipped between the tall buildings like icy knives. Thomas had found relative shelter in the alcove of an old department store, where the building's warmth still seeped through the walls. That's when he first noticed the businessman, standing motionless in the snow for nearly an hour. Something about the man's demeanor struck Thomas as unusual. Despite his expensive wool coat and leather briefcase, he seemed lost, almost disconnected from reality. Thomas had seen that look before, in combat veterans right after a firefight, in patients who'd received devastating news, and in his own reflection after Linda's death. The businessman hadn't moved or sought shelter, even as the snow began coating his shoulders. His tie fluttered in the wind, and his Italian leather shoes were becoming ruined by the slush, but he seemed oblivious to it all. Thomas watched as people hurried past, some casting concerned glances, others deliberately averting their eyes, a reaction Thomas knew all too well. When Thomas approached him with half the sandwich, the man initially didn't react. It took several gentle attempts before he finally turned, revealing red-rimmed eyes and tear-stained cheeks. "I'm Richard," he said, his voice barely a whisper, accepting the sandwich with trembling hands. The simple act of speaking seemed to break something loose in him. As they huddled in the alcove, sharing the meager meal, Richard began to talk. He spoke of his successful real estate company, his empty penthouse apartment, and the crushing loneliness that had driven him to wander the streets that night. It was the anniversary of his wife's death, he explained, and he couldn't bear to be alone in his office or home anymore. Thomas listened, recognizing the raw grief in Richard's voice. They shared stories of their lost loves, finding unexpected comfort in their shared pain. Richard spoke of his wife. Catherine's work with children, her passion for helping others, and her tragic death in a car accident. With each detail, Thomas felt an odd sense of familiarity, but he couldn't quite place why. As the night grew colder, Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photograph he always carried, the last picture taken of Catherine. His hand shook as he held it out, seeking to share his wife's memory with this kind stranger who had shown him such unexpected compassion. The moment Thomas saw the photograph, the sandwich half fell from his hands. The woman in the picture was smiling broadly, her arms around a young patient in a hospital bed. Thomas recognized not only the hospital room but also the distinctive butterfly pendant around her neck. He had helped Linda pick it out for Catherine, her favorite volunteer at the children's ward, just weeks before the accident that would claim his own wife's life. The coincidence was too profound to be mere chance. As realization dawned on both men's faces, the wind continued to howl around them, carrying with it the weight of their shared past and the promise of an extraordinary revelation that would reshape both their futures. Let me know when you'd like me to continue with part 4 by giving the continue command. As Richard and Thomas stared at the photograph, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air, memories began flooding back. Richard's hands trembled as he recalled how his late wife Catherine had often spoken of a remarkable nurse named Linda who had mentored her during her volunteer work at the children's ward. Linda had inspired Catherine to pursue nursing school herself, though she never got the chance to fulfill that dream. "You're Linda," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the one who gave Catherine this butterfly pendant, wasn't she? Catherine never took it off. She was wearing it the night of the accident." His fingers traced the outline of the necklace in the photograph, the same pendant that now lay in a velvet box in his penthouse safe, one of his most treasured possessions. The revelation struck them both like a physical force. Catherine had died the same night as Linda, both victims of drunk drivers on that tragic October evening. While Thomas had been working in the ER, Catherine had been driving home from a late-night volunteer shift at another hospital across town. The parallel tragedies had sent both men spiraling down vastly different but equally devastating paths. Richard's story began to pour out. After Catherine's death, he had thrown himself into his work, building his real estate empire as a way to numb the pain. Each new building, each successful project was a brick in the wall he'd built around his grief. His company, Sterling Development, had become one of Chicago's largest property developers, but success had brought him no peace. What Thomas didn't know was that Richard had been searching for him for years. Catherine had often spoken about Linda's husband, the skilled nurse who had served as a combat medic. After her death, Richard had tried to find him, wanting to thank the couple who had meant so much to Catherine. But by the time he'd begun his search, Thomas had already disappeared into the anonymity of the streets. The irony was almost too much to bear. Richard owned the very building they were huddled against. His office was just 20 stories above them, where he'd spent countless late nights staring down at the streets below, never knowing that the man he'd been searching for was right there all along. As they talked through the night, Richard revealed more about his current life. His outward success masked a deep inner turmoil. He'd been going through the motions for years, attending board meetings, signing contracts, and building an empire that meant nothing to him. The only thing that still gave him purpose was a small foundation he'd started in Catherine's name, providing scholarships for aspiring nurses. That evening, Richard had left his office, intending to end it all. The weight of his loneliness, especially powerful on the anniversary of Catherine's death, had become unbearable. He'd been standing there, contemplating his future, when Thomas had approached with the offered sandwich, an act of kindness that had pulled him back from the brink. Thomas listened, his medical training kicking in as he recognized the signs of severe depression in Richard's words. The same skills that had once helped him save lives in combat and in the ER now helped him recognize a soul in crisis. As he shared his own story of loss and survival, he found himself doing what he did best, helping someone heal, even if this time the wounds were emotional rather than physical. The night grew colder, but neither man noticed. They were too engrossed in untangling the threads of fate that had brought them together in such an extraordinary way. As dawn approached, Richard reached a decision that would change both their lives forever, though he kept it to himself for the moment. Looking at Thomas, he saw not just his wife's friend's husband, but a man whose strength and compassion had survived decades of hardship, a man whose skills and experience could help him transform Catherine's foundation into something far more meaningful. Let me know when you'd like me to continue with Part 5 by giving the continue command. The following week found Thomas and Richard seated in the warmth of Richard's penthouse office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The contrast between this space and Thomas's usual surroundings couldn't have been more stark, yet there was something else capturing both men's attention. Spread across Richard's mahogany desk were photographs, letters, and mementos from both Catherine and Linda's lives. Among them was a Christmas card from 1992, showing both women at the hospital's children's ward Christmas party, their arms around each other as they helped a young patient decorate a small tree. Another photograph showed them at a hospital fundraiser, both wearing their butterfly pendants. Each image unveiled another layer of their shared history, revealing how deeply intertwined their lives had been. Richard pulled out an old journal of Catherine's he'd never had the heart to read before. Inside, she'd written extensively about her experiences at the hospital, and Linda's name appeared on nearly every page. There were detailed accounts of the lessons Linda had taught her, not just about nursing, but about life, compassion, and the importance of small kindnesses. One entry particularly stood out: Linda's husband came by today with lunch for both of us. He's just like her, they both have this incredible gift for making people feel cared for. He showed me how to properly dress a wound while telling the funniest stories about his time as a combat medic. As they pored over these memories, Richard shared something he'd been keeping to himself. Catherine's foundation, which had started as a simple scholarship program, had recently acquired a struggling veterans medical center. His original plan had been to renovate it into luxury apartments, but something had held him back from starting the demolition. Now, looking at Thomas, he understood why. The recognition of their shared past deepened as they discovered more connections. Thomas remembered helping Catherine prepare for her nursing school entrance exams, though she never got the chance to take them. Richard recalled Catherine coming home excited about a new emergency response technique Linda had taught her, one that Thomas had learned in combat. But the most profound recognition came when Richard opened a small box containing Catherine's personal effects from the night of the accident. Inside was a half-written letter addressed to Linda, dated the very day of the crash. In it, Catherine expressed her gratitude for Linda's mentorship and shared exciting news: she had been accepted into nursing school and wanted Linda to be the first to know. Thomas's hand shook as he read the letter. Linda had died, never knowing that she had helped Catherine achieve her dream. The timing was almost too cruel to comprehend. Both women had been carrying life-changing news for each other on the night their lives were cut short. As evening approached, Richard's assistant brought in some dinner, and the men continued talking. They shared stories about their wives' friendship, filling in gaps in each other's memories. Richard learned that the butterfly pendants had been a symbol of transformation, Linda's gift to Catherine when she first expressed interest in becoming a nurse. Thomas discovered that Catherine had been planning a surprise celebration for Linda's upcoming promotion to head nurse, a position she never got to accept. The recognition of their shared loss and intertwined past created a bond between them that transcended their current circumstances. As they talked, both men began to see something they had been missing for years: a chance to honor their wives' legacies in a way that could make a real difference in others' lives. As night fell over Chicago, the city lights twinkling below them like stars, Richard reached for an architectural rendering he'd had prepared for the Veterans Medical Center. He hesitated for a moment before sliding it across the desk to Thomas, a proposal forming in his mind that would change both their lives forever. "Let me know when you'd like me to continue with Part 6 by giving the continue command." The architectural plans Richard shared that evening were just the beginning. The Veterans Medical Center, once slated for demolition, was about to become a beacon of hope. Richard's proposal was both simple and profound. He wanted Thomas to help transform the facility into a state-of-the-art medical center for veterans, combining housing assistance with healthcare services. Over cups of strong coffee, Richard laid out his vision. The center would be renamed the Catherine and Linda Memorial Veterans Center, offering not just medical care but also transitional housing and job training. The top floor would house a specialized children's clinic, honoring both women's dedication to helping young patients. Thomas listened intently, his medical expertise already spotting ways to improve the proposed layout. His years on the streets had given him unique insights into what homeless veterans truly needed. "The waiting area needs to be more welcoming," he suggested, pointing to the blueprints. "Many vets struggle with PTSD, they need spaces that feel safe, not institutional." Richard watched in amazement as Thomas transformed before his eyes. The quiet homeless man was gone, replaced by the confident medical professional he'd once been. Thomas spoke about creating a comprehensive support system, drawing from his own experiences both as a medical professional and as someone who had experienced homelessness. But when Richard mentioned his plan to have Thomas serve as the center's director, Thomas balked. "I haven't practiced medicine in years," he protested, his insecurity showing through. "My license expired long ago." Richard had anticipated this and pulled out another document: enrollment papers for a medical license renewal program, already arranged through his connections at the state medical board. Over the next few weeks, Thomas moved into a furnished apartment Richard owned near the construction site. Each morning, he would walk to the center, working with the architects and contractors, while spending his afternoons studying for his license recertification. The shelter staff, especially Mrs. Chen, were overjoyed to hear about his second chance, though they missed their document. The transformation wasn't easy. Thomas struggled with imposter syndrome, sometimes waking in cold sweats, convinced he was back on the streets. Richard arranged for counseling, understanding that healing would take time. They both attended grief support groups, finally confronting the decades of unprocessed loss they'd carried. Construction crews worked through winter, and Thomas's medical knowledge proved invaluable in designing the facility. He insisted on details others might have missed: private consultation rooms with exits that made veterans feel secure, a garden space similar to the one where he and Linda used to have lunch, and a children's waiting area filled with natural light. As spring approached, Thomas passed his recertification exams with flying colors. His years of reading medical journals in the library had kept his knowledge current, and his practical experience, both as a combat medic and an ER nurse, gave him insights textbooks couldn't teach. The same hands that had once shared a sandwich with a stranger were now signing medical supply orders and drafting treatment protocols. Richard, too, found himself changing. Working with Thomas gave him a sense of purpose he'd lost after Catherine's death. He began spending less time in board meetings and more time at the center, learning about veteran healthcare needs and using his business connections to secure additional funding and support. As the center neared completion, Thomas and Richard stood together on the rooftop garden, now planted with butterfly bushes in memory of their wives. Below them, the Chicago streets where they'd first met stretched out like veins through the city. Both men knew that their chance encounter that cold night hadn't just been about saving each other, it had been about creating something that would save others for years to come. Let me know when you'd like me to continue with part 7, the final part, by giving the continue command. 1 year to the day after sharing that sandwich, Thomas and Richard stood together at the grand opening of the Catherine and Linda Memorial Veterans Center. The morning sun caught the butterfly-shaped wind chimes hanging in the garden, creating dancing patterns of light across the gathering crowd. Veterans, community leaders, and media had all come to witness what many were calling a revolutionary approach to veteran care. Thomas, now dressed in a crisp white doctor's coat, his silver hair neatly trimmed, looked nothing like the homeless man he'd been a year ago. Yet he carried that experience with him in every decision he made. The center's intake process was designed to be welcoming and dignified. There were no lengthy forms to fill out before receiving care, they'd help with paperwork after addressing immediate needs. The facility had already begun accepting patients during its soft opening. A former Marine who'd been living in his car was now working as the center's maintenance supervisor. A retired Army nurse who'd lost her home to medical bills was helping coordinate the medical staff. Each success story reflected the center's mission of not just providing care, but restoring dignity and purpose. Richard watched proudly as Thomas gave the opening speech, sharing their story with the gathered crowd. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience as he spoke about Linda and Catherine, about second chances, and about how a simple act of kindness could change lives. He didn't shy away from talking about his years on the streets, using his experience to emphasize the thin line between stability and crisis that many veterans walk. The children's clinic on the top floor had become something special. They'd hired pediatric specialists who understood the unique challenges faced by veterans' families. The walls were decorated with butterfly murals, and each examination room was named after a different type of butterfly, a tribute to the pendants that had connected their wives years ago. As Thomas led tours through the facility, he would stop at a particular wall in the main lobby. There hung 2 photographs, one of Linda and Catherine at that long-ago Christmas party, and beside it, a framed image of half a sandwich on a snowy Chicago street. Beneath them was a simple plaque that read, "Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything." The center became more than just a medical facility. It was a testament to the power of human connection, to the way lives can interweave in unexpected patterns, and to the truth that it's never too late for a new beginning. Richard's business skills and Thomas's medical expertise had combined to create something neither could have achieved alone. By sunset on opening day, as the last of the visitors left, Thomas and Richard stood in the rooftop garden. The butterfly bushes were beginning to bloom, attracting real butterflies that danced in the evening light. Below them, the streets where they'd first met were visible, but they looked different now, not as places of despair, but as paths that had led them exactly where they needed to be. Linda and Catherine would be proud, Richard said softly, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on. Thomas nodded, touching the new butterfly pendant he wore on his doctor's coat. "They brought us together," he replied. "Their love keeps changing lives, even now." In the end, their story wasn't just about 2 men finding redemption. It was about the ripple effect of compassion, how a single moment of kindness could expand into waves of change. The center stood as proof that while grief might bend us, love and purpose can reshape us into something stronger, something more beautiful than before. And somewhere, on that same street corner where it all began, another sandwich was being shared, another connection was being made, another story was beginning. The end.